Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 11th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. That's because I rely on the support of individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic, for now, basis, I think that model is going to have to change soon. All you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Christopher Jansen. Krister Jansen, Anu Badavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Thomas Sadovic, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Victor Ryabtsev, Brian Holden, Chuck Blell, David Compton, Eric Sole Hagspo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamori, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. It's been a tough week for many of us, and I record some of these episodes in previously. So the episode you're about to hear, we recorded long before the election. I'm actually recording this intro on November 6th to get it to my editor in time, which means that I am in full grieving mode. By the time this comes out, I probably still will be. So I don't want to spend any time really digging into that or talking about it. Maybe it'll come up in future episodes. But for now, I'm hoping that this episode is a little bit of a palate cleanser for you all. I had the opportunity to chat with Josh L. Davis. He's the author of A Little Queer Natural History. He's a science writer for the Natural History Museum London with a background in biology and conservation, and he's written for a bunch of outlets that you know and love, including Manga Bay, I Fucking Love Science, The Observer, The Guardian, and The Times. So without any further ado, here he is, Josh L. Davis. Well, Josh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So we are connecting over, across the pond. You are in London right now?
Yep. Yeah, I'm in a very damp, dark London, as probably is quite standard.
How sad. It's because you're 8 hours ahead of me. I'm all the way on the West Coast, so it's a bigger time difference. So it's evening for you. But I really appreciate you joining us to talk about your new book, A Little Queer Natural History. I just want to dive right in because, okay, you're a science writer and you've written for a bunch of different outlets, but you also are a science writer for the Natural History Museum London. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's quite it's a bit of a plushy job, actually. I've got to be honest. So I'm effectively an in-house sort of science writer, science journalist for the Natural History Museum, which means that I get to chat to. There's about, I don't know, it's something like 350 odd scientists who work at the Natural History Museum behind the scenes, sort of researching the collections and, maintaining it and all the curators and all that sort of stuff. And they are constantly, obviously, producing research about what they're working on and what they're doing. So my job is effectively to talk to them about what they're up to and then write about it and sort of shout about it and tell everyone. Yeah, it's quite a rare thing, I think, to find a job in a Natural History Museum talking about science in such a way. So I'm very, very fortunate. And as someone who, I'm from London, I used to go to the Natural History Museum all the time as a child. So to be able to then say, I work there writing about what they're up to, is dream job, really.
That's so cool. I remember the last time I was there, I was lucky enough, a friend of mine connected me with her friend who maybe he's still there, the curator of fish, I think. So there's this kind of it felt very basement-y fish collections, and there's a cabinet in it with a bunch of original Darwin finches and tags, and it was just the coolest thing to be able to go behind the scenes and, I don't know, hold these big shark jaws and angler fishes, and I don't know, it was amazing. It smelled down there, but it was super fun.
Yeah, that is one of the absolute perks of the job, is that I get to sort of lurk around all of those collections behind the scenes and
Oh,
sort
I
of
love
get a
it.
peek in. Yeah, you just have drawers and drawers of like, as you said, like fish, mammals. The paleontology collection is extraordinary. They just like open a drawer and there's a big T-Rex, jawbone in there, and you're just like, huh, that's wild. And what I think is also amazing about things, it's not even just like the fact that they have it, it's then like the provenance of all of that stuff. So for example, that T-Rex jaw is the first T-Rex ever found. So you're getting
Wow. Yeah.
exactly. So you're getting like, not just like Darwin specimens, you're also getting like these extraordinary, like historically significant stuff. And I sort of I suspect I'm one of the few people at the museum who've been into more collections than most, just purely because my job allows me to go and talk to these people, and I just say, "Can I go and actually have a look at it?" And most of the time, the researchers, the curators, are more than happy to show everyone what they're working on.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I think, yeah, sometimes people don't realize, especially in natural history museums, that the stuff that's on display is cool, but the really cool stuff
Yeah, exactly.
is not always on display.
Well, yeah, because they don't, because it's way too valuable, most of the stuff that's behind the scenes. Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this one.
And sometimes they rotate things, certain things are out that then get back. But yeah, be like, there's that one thing that's like, ooh, and then you're like, oh yeah, we have 15 more back here.
Exactly. Yeah. We just have drawers and drawers of it.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. That's so cool. So I have to ask how you got into kind of science journalism. Did you do the J school path? Did you do more the academic science path, or did you take some other route?
Yeah, it was all entirely accidental. Um, so I mean, like, ironically, when I was, at high school, I absolutely hated English. It was probably my least favorite subject, maybe except for maths, probably. Um, but I went down very much the biology, zoology side of things. So I did at university. I was a research assistant studying gorillas in Central Africa for a little bit. Um, and then I got back to the UK and effectively couldn't get a job. So, I was trying to get a job as an ecologist, something in conservation. It just wasn't happening. And there was a science writing competition for The Guardian in the UK. And I just sort of, on a whim, applied, sent in, I think it was like 400 words or something, and came second in the competition. And it all just sort of like kicked off from there. Yeah. So I was in no way planned. It was sort of me just sort of learning as I went along and sort of finding my feet as I go. Really, it was yeah, very fortunate, but it's very difficult to sort of recommend or
Right,
what I mean, replicate. It's just like, oh yeah, I sort of like fell into it by accident and didn't give up, I guess.
Well, and I think that those are two big takeaways when I have a similar path in some ways. I've spoken to a lot of people, and I don't mean similar like it's nothing like yours, but similar in the sense that like you couldn't predict it. And I've spoken to quite a few people on the podcast who also tell stories like that. And yeah, I feel like while it's impossible to say do step 1, step 2, step 3 and you'll be where I am, I think the big takeaway is when a door opens, you're never going to know unless you are sort of brave and bold enough to just walk through it.
Yeah, and you push on it as well. I mean, I remember
Right.
when I first started, and it was at that awards, the award ceremony. It was this writing competition, and in the room was just a bunch of, journalists from across UK media, from BBC, Guardian, Telegraph, all of that stuff. And I said to myself when I was there, I knew it. It's like, I'm going to have to go to every single one of these people and just basically ask for their details. And that's what I did. And I woke up the next morning and I had a little notebook and it just had list after list of journalist's name and their email address. Then I spent the next couple of days emailing every single one of them and just saying, I talked to you last night. Do you have any advice? Do you have any opportunities? I just sort of nailed it through that. And eventually, one of them came through at The Guardian, and that was it, really. I say that was it. It was really hard.
It wasn't just like, and there you go.
It was years and years of freelancing and earning very little money doing it. But it was a contact at a national paper, and I didn't let that contact, go cold. I just kept hammering at it.
Yeah, and now you have that sort of benefit of hindsight where you can set back and go, and there you have it. Although at the time you did not know there you had it, you did not
Exactly.
think you had it at all. Yeah, it's time is funny like that, isn't
It
it?
is. And I also just think it was about, it's just a, and this is something which my partner always says, he always tells me, because he also he works in the media as well. And he says, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? You just have to sort of keep saying something and keep raising your voice a little bit and being like, I'm over here, and reminding people that you exist. And that's how you sort of get your way through it, particularly in something like journalism, I think, where it's so fast paced and there's always someone coming up behind you and you just sort of have to keep on top of it.
Absolutely. So I have to ask this lovely little book that you wrote, A Little Queer Natural History. Is this your first book?
It is my first book, rather excitingly. I know.
Gosh, congratulations. This is very exciting. So tell me a little bit about, I mean, you mentioned you mentioned that you are gay. You mentioned, well, actually you didn't say you were gay. I don't want to put that label on you, but you mentioned that you have a male partner. And the book is about sort of different organisms, different animals in on the planet that engage or that identify. We don't know if they identify, but engage in what we sort of anthropomorphically would call queer behavior. How did you come to want to write this book?
Yeah, that sort of, it's been bubbling away for the last probably 6 years, really, since I started at the Natural History Museum. So when I first
Mm-hmm.
started, I got roped. Well, I don't want to say roped in. That makes it sound like it was unwilling on my behalf. I was very much a willing participant to co-produce and eventually lead the Natural History Museum's first ever sort of LGBTQ plus natural history tour, like in person in the museum. So I first started sort of researching it. I think it was about 2019, maybe 2018. Who knows?
Pre-COVID, it all blurs
Exactly.
together. Yeah.
It's meaningless by this point. And I and so that's when I really started thinking about it and getting interested. And as I was sort of doing this research and over the sort of preceding years, I would do, various events at the museum, like Valentine's night. I would have like a stall with queer specimens on and stuff like that. And we were using, the specimens on display in the museum to talk about these behaviors, which in and of itself is not necessarily easy because for most of the time these animals aren't actually on display, so it's normally something linked to those animals that you then have to use as like a kickoff board, basically. And that is in itself a problem and something which is for me, I find frustrating and irritating within sort of the museum sector in general, where these stories are still actually quite difficult to talk about and uncover, even in 2024. But as I was going through all that research, it was like all of these really interesting things and these really fascinating and fun and intriguing biologies and behaviors that I just kept coming across. But I would find them in all like really niche or like disparate locations. So you'd have one news article here talking about this one case of some amazing animal has given birth via parthenogenesis, which is where only the females pass on their genetic information without the input of any males. So you'd find like one example there, and then you'd maybe find some science article buried in some journal from 20 years ago also reporting on this. And they were all in these really odd locations. And as I was researching, it was so hard, to bring it all together in my brain. So I just started keeping a list of these things and keeping a note of where I was finding all of this stuff. And eventually it got to the point where I was like, there just needs to be one coherent place where, I mean, the idea of the book isn't to set out like every single example of these behaviors or these biologies, but to give, one example of, and then hopefully send the reader down a bit of a rabbit hole themselves where it gives them a bit of a starting point. But to bring all these behaviors and biologies into sort of one coherent book, I guess, and to give a bit of an overview of these behaviors in the natural world, because they are amazing and they are just so prevalent and they're everywhere. And as soon as you start looking and as soon as you start researching, you start realizing, the vast majority of species of animals are probably engaging in some form of queer behavior.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible even how you sort of chose what to highlight. Like you mentioned before, parthenogenesis. I'm flipping through the book right now, and we've got the New Mexico whiptail lizard, but then we've got Western lowland gorillas who are sort of the chapter for queer behavior in apes. Swans, male couples as parents, the European eel, environment dependent sex determination, Western gull, lesbian mothers. So you have all of these different sort of I shouldn't say either or because I think it's probably both, but uh, I guess we could say biological behaviors, sort of developmental behaviors, but also uh, interpersonal behaviors or kinship relationships that we see as well that kind of represent or encapsulate a lot of the things that as a human species we're often grappling with societally.
Yeah, so I think for me the idea was to, I mean, I know obviously the title is talking about, queer behaviours or gay behaviour. In the UK, it's published as a little gay natural history. It's sort of on the surface, I think that is how we've presented it because that is how most people experience these behaviours or, first come to hear about these behaviours. You hear about the gay couples of penguins in zoos and things like that. And so that's quite a nice, easy in for most people. But for me, I, was really keen to talk about other, what I determine effectively like sort of non-heterosexual behaviors, I guess, or, non-heteronormative behaviors. So something which isn't predicated on, that traditional viewpoint of one male, one female having a family together. That's
Yeah,
the
it's
way that
it's the
I,
L and the G and the B and the T and the Q
exactly,
and the I.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
And even more things that we
exactly.
as humans can't do or haven't figured out how to do.
No, I don't understand. I mean, again,
Yeah.
you mentioned like the sort of range of species present or like in the book. One thing I was really keen to include was plants, for example, because when we're having these conversations about sort of queer behaviors, it is almost always exclusively talking about animals and even then usually vertebrates, right? And that is excluding a huge swathe of life, which has all of this extraordinary diversity. And plants, when we're talking about them, that was probably my favorite bit to research and to look up because it completely blew my mind. Because as a biologist and a zoologist, surprise, surprise, I was focusing on animals, as probably most biologists do, right? And learning about plants completely changed my perspective on things and like how all of this is organized and how it all works. And it is, even this notion that, obviously quite a large portion of the book is, dealing with, male, female and what that means. And when you're talking about these categories and like how to put things in boxes, we quite often, and botanists themselves talk about plants as having, either being male and female or having male and female structures. But when you start to actually dig down into it, that doesn't really exist. And that is just, we're just using those terms because we sort of know what they mean and it sort of works out when you're talking about plants. But it doesn't really if you actually start to interrogate it more than sort of skin deep, basically.
I mean, we literally refer to like sockets, like outlets in the wall, and plugs as male and
Exactly.
female.
Yeah.
Like it's a bit on the nose. It's a bit simplistic, I think. But you're right. Like they're, looking at some of the plants and even some of the like fungus and the different organisms in your book that, for example, are all genders and no genders or whose genders change because I don't know the it's a little hotter over here. It's a little colder over there. Like can you imagine what a cool feature that we don't have that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things which one of the reasons I love this topic and one of the reasons I was so keen to write about it and to produce something on it is because the world is endlessly diverse. And it's all of these, we have these hard and fast rules, but there's always like oh yeah, but, or, there's always just like something in the brackets being like, mostly, or,
Yeah.
often this is the case.
Yeah. I used to teach like intro bio, I would always tell my students like a big red flag on an exam is if something says often or if something says always or never. It's probably false.
And it's just
Probably
like,
false.
it's like everything in biology is always caveated with those
Yep.
sorts of terminology. And, I just think that's what really interests me. It's all like those edge cases, because that is, if you start to actually look at the world from those perspectives, from those ideas, you get an entirely different perspective on it, and you kind of see things in an entirely different light, and it sends you down a completely different route. And that, to me, is really exciting and like way more interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I've long grappled with on this show, I've been doing this Talk Nerdy specifically for about 10 years. And I've noticed that throughout that time, a theme that I come back to over and over and over is this theme of taxonomy, categorization, like you mentioned before, putting things in boxes, finding appropriate labels, knowing that there are edge cases, knowing that this is a human construct, that we feel safer in the world when everything has a home and a place, and when things are all in the gray, we get really uncomfortable with the uncertainty. But I also like to sit with the realization and the honest truth that as the observer, as the person reading the book that you wrote, I am a person, and my frame is going to be the frame that I approach your book with. And hopefully I'm opening up that frame and adjusting and adapting, and I'm learning sort of paradigm or perspective shifts. But at the same time, there is always that constraint. I am a human being attempting to learn about the world through my own eyes. And so I'm curious, when you sit down and you think about this topic specifically, is one of the questions you ask, okay, what are all the different ways to be non-normative, like kind of hetero and cis-normative as a person? And what are some parallel examples of that across different living organisms? Like, how can I relate these behaviors in the wild to constructs that we already understand as human beings? And then maybe beyond that, whoa, now I'm really going to blow your mind, because here's some stuff that like we don't have any concept of.
I mean, for me, when I was writing and I'm learning about this sort of topic and this subject, and I'm quite clear in the beginning of the book, like the point of this book is not to justify any of these behaviors or any of these biologies, because fundamentally, they need no justification. They just are, exactly. There is no need to sort of have any moral argument for or against any of this. It exists. That should be enough as it is. So I'm quite keen from that point, not really to draw any parallels between what we're seeing in nature and what we're seeing in humans, although, that is inevitable. And actually, when you're looking at the history of sort of queer natural history and the research that's gone into it, those parallels are drawn from a really, really early point in time. So there's this amazing paper from, I think it's 1780, by a man, a Scottish naturalist named John Hunter. And it's a paper titled An Account of an Extraordinary Pheasant. And in it, he talks about a female pheasant with female typical plumage that seemingly sort of overnight loses its female typical plumage and develops male typical plumage. And not only that, it also develops sort of male typical behavior. So it starts trying to, mate with the other hens and that kind of stuff. And he calls them sex transformative birds. We know that now is technically incorrect. What is seemingly going on in galliforms, so those are your birds which include, pheasants, hens, pheasants, chickens, peacocks, that kind of quails, all of those birds. The default plumage is seemingly male, and it is the influence of hormones produced by the ovaries that sort of override that and produce the female typical plumage. And so when those ovaries are damaged or the hormonal balance is off, that can sort of cause this shift. But what's so interesting about that, in 1780, he immediately, basically in this paper, starts to compare it to what he thinks he sees in people. So he uses it as a way to explain, for example, older women growing beards.
Right. So he's like, this animal is going through menopause.
To a certain extent. Yeah. And so, but I find that so fascinating that from the very outset, from very early on, people are using, as I guess is only natural, the natural world as a lens to see humanity. And then you see it again in the 1840s when there's particularly in France, on the continent, so in like France and Germany, there are like these really weirdly intense debates about. They start noticing hilariously lots of cockchafer beetles having gay sex, and so they are again on when you're reading these texts using it almost as a proxy to talk about human behavior and male male behavior, because that was obviously still very illegal at the time. And so they're referring to these beetles as, for example, like the active and passive partners, which are very human terms. And so whilst I try not to do that myself, because I just, as I say, it needs no justification. Also, you fall into that trap, don't you, of that naturalistic fallacy.
Oh, I can't help it either. I mean, even
Yeah.
as you were describing your sort of positioning, your frame as you went into this, I was already making a comparison to a lot of the social kind of anti-trans, transphobic, or TERF rhetoric that you often see, where it's like, no, but why don't they? And it's like, okay, they exist. Yeah. they just exist. Like, we cannot argue about whether or not a human being exists. And they exist as they are. And like, you can moralize it all you want, but you cannot sit here and tell me that they aren't them. Like, it's just, exactly. You just can't. But of course, I saw that parallel immediately to us, because apparently I'm a narcissist. I don't know. I think that maybe we all are just a little bit narcissistic as people.
But as I say, I think it is only natural that people, this is how, from the very beginning, people have used nature and animals and their behavior to talk about or to see or to explain human behavior. I think that is only a very natural thing, because as a species, we are quite narcissistic, right? We are constantly trying to find out what our own origins are and what the reasons behind our own behavior is. And part of that is, fundamentally looking at the natural world.
Right, because we are animals.
Yeah,
we're animals.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something kind of beautiful and validating as well, especially for an individual who has long grappled in their life with feeling non-normative, right? With feeling like they have pressures to be a certain way, but they just fundamentally are not that way, because the way that they are is valid. And when you see an example in the animal kingdom, or in a plant, but very often I think with like in mammals or in, like you mentioned, vertebrates, like something that feels kind of, I guess, connected evolutionarily, it can be quite like affirming. Like, okay, you guys have been telling me my whole life that this is not natural, or that this is aberrant, or that, but like, look at all these animals that engage in this behavior.
I mean, to me, another aspect I find really interesting is like when we're looking at like that historical side of things, and how often those behaviors have been sort of, either ignored or covered up or disparaged throughout the history, as almost a thought experiment to sort of think, how would things be different if that hadn't been the case, and we had been talking about these behaviors from the very start, and it hadn't been used, throughout the 20th century as, there are no gay animals, therefore there shouldn't be any, there's no gay people, it's against God's will. That was like that persistent argument throughout all of the 20th century. And if actually people had been talking about these things openly and, discussing what they had seen and not covering it up or ignoring it, how those conversations might have been different and how the situation might have changed. I mean, maybe it wouldn't happen. They would have just come up with some other excuse, which I'm probably sure they would have. But it's an interesting perspective on how things might have worked out differently.
Absolutely. I often think, as a psychologist and somebody who had too many statistics courses rammed down my throat, I see a normal curve in my head, and I see how spread out it is, and I see if it has skew or kurtosis. And when I think about, terms like normal or average, which often get morphed into these value-laden or moralistic judgments of should be, which is absolutely not valid. I think we often think we look in the middle of that curve and we go, okay, here's normal. And then as we kind of turn to either edge to these edge cases like you mentioned, and we go, okay, out there that's less normal, that's more aberrant, that's less like the rest of the crowd. But there is a different perspective, which is to zoom out a bit and say this is variability, and it is normal to be variant.
Yeah, and like
that is normative.
That language and those sort of biases about what is quote unquote normal also, you know, when you're looking at the literature and research, you know, scientific research papers, it bleeds into all of that work and in, like, you know, reviewed journals and that side of things. So there are plenty of cases where one of my favorite titles is it's a paper from, I think it's 1987, which again is just like, to me, bafflingly late, in which it is titled The Moral Lowerings of the Mazarine Butterfly.
Amazing.
And it's like, how are you genuinely writing this piece in a scientific journal talking about the moral lowerings of a butterfly? It's like, it's extraordinary.
Been hanging out in seedy bars.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what is it doing?
Bad decisions.
Cheating on his wife, you know, all sorts of things.
And I think that's the thing too, is that the normativity question gets turned on its ear, because one of the things that I grapple with, you know, and this is a little bit of self-disclosure, but I think I've disclosed this before on the show. You know, so I'm bisexual, but I'm also like non-normative in my relationship structure approaches. So I tend to identify as ethically non-monogamous. And I think monogamy is one of those really interesting questions, because even with some of my closest friends who I feel like are very deep thinkers, who are very kind of like educated and academic, they have this moralistic layer to relationship structures where they'll often say things like, oh no, I'm a monogamous, it's how I'm sort of programmed. And I'm like, by society. It's how you're programmed by society. But they don't, they're like, nope, this is just who I am. And my brain wants this. And I'm like, oh God. And I think it's funny because that is one of those sticking points that I run into even among pretty progressive liberal thinkers, that somehow pair bonding and like ultra monogamy is the natural order. And I'm like, where in nature have you ever seen?
you see this creep in over and over, particularly within birds, right? Everyone always goes on about how birds are, you know, monogamous individual, penguins, swans, everything.
Which makes me crazy, because tell me if this is true, like maybe for a breeding season, and also aren't they cheating out the ass?
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, like, it's the whole point is like they are socially monogamous. So they will pair up with their partner for the breeding season, but they're not necessarily sexually monogamous. When you actually look at like the paternity of eggs and things like that, there is a lot of variability and there's a lot of different fathers involved. And it's
I think that people do something similar when they have children. And that's really what we're talking about, right? Even non-monogamous people make intentional relationships with partners so that their children have stability. You know, like that's a choice that's made. But it's true. We also, I think, disconnect I disconnect child rearing from sex, from love, from all of those things. But I think that they're all blurred together a little bit in our sort of anthropocentric, I don't know, moralistic view.
Another really good example, which I think highlights really nicely like how those sort of human biases have crept into how we sort of talk about and sort of normalize various behaviors in the natural world, is when it comes to, again, there's a chapter or a piece in the book about bluegill sunfish, in which, so these are fish that live in the US, and they have this like genuinely amazing, although not that unusual, breeding system in which you have females, and there's effectively like 3 different types of males. You have large males, intermediate males, and smaller males. And the large males have what I guess we'd call like sort of male presenting, and they are the ones that create a nest in the sand and like guard that nest and do everything that we would traditionally regard as being, you know, male masculine things. And then the intermediate males have female typical markings, and then you have the smaller males which they don't really look like anything either. They're a bit cryptic, and they sort of dart in and fertilize eggs effectively whenever they get the chance. But all the literature constantly refers to those intermediate males as being sneaky males that will cuckold the larger males by pretending to be female, and that they will steal fertilizations from those larger males. And it just, like, paper after paper, no one is questioning how this language is being used. It almost makes me want to tear my hair out, because I'm just like, so are you implying that the larger male is therefore owed the right to mate with the females?
Right. Yeah. They definitely are implying that.
Exactly.
I think that all of scientific literature implies that there is this, because we see it all the time too. I know it's like really gross, but talking about sort of assault or rape, like in human terms versus animal terms, gets very, very like wiggly. But there is this view that sort of like the natural order is that she is a receptacle for his sperm, and he's going to get it anyway, and then she is going to produce the child, because otherwise, what is the point of existence?
Exactly. And then like these female presenting males are therefore, cuckold. There's one paper which calls the large males like bourgeois males, and you're just like, this is madness. And they quite frequently will also refer to those intermediate and the smaller males as being the alternative mating strategy, even though in some populations they make up 80% of all males.
Just because it doesn't look like the way like that
we think it should.
Yeah, exactly.
And these fish, bluegill sunfish, are not the only animals that have this system. There's a bird called the ruff. They also have a very similar system to this. And again, it is exactly the same language being employed when you're talking about these, what they call in birding terms, these female mimic males. It's just...
It's also really funny because, again, I'm doing the thing that, like we said, probably I shouldn't do, but I'm doing the thing where I think about like the wild of the apps. And when I think about the wild that is the dating apps, even what human beings consider normative, these sort of like alpha identified males, the way that they're represented in film and television, the way that like, I don't think those are the ones that are as successful, if I'm being honest. I think that very often women are interested in different features than male scientists think that women are interested in these heterosexual pairs. So it's very funny.
My female friends always lament the fact that whenever they go on these dating apps, there's always like some guy holding a fish or something.
Yeah,
it's just,
the guy with the muscles holding the fish.
It's like, in what way did you think that this would attract me?
The male gaze, that's why. No, it's very funny that like the minute that you sort of see, I guess, I mean, let's call it what it is, like patriarchy, and you really start to understand and research patriarchal exchanges, you see it everywhere. It's that's what the Barbie movie was about, right? Like the minute that you start to see kind of like male supremacy and heteronormativity for what it really is, and for how these systems have been perpetuated through much of human history, you can't not see it. It's the water.
Yeah. And what I find fascinating about that is, if you, again, as you say, you start seeing it everywhere. And there have been papers that have looked at, for example, natural history displays in natural history museums. And more often than not, for example, you'll have the male specimens are on display and not the female specimens. Or if there is a male and a female specimen, particularly within birds, for example, the male specimen will be higher than the female specimen, for example. Exactly, and you get all of this. And so I was also did a little bit of research a couple of years ago with some friends at the Natural History Museum, and we looked through all of the data records and the labels for mammal and bird specimens in natural history museums, and you find a male bias for specimens, even in the collections.
Just like in terms of the number of actual...
there are slightly more males in collections than there are females. And some of this is like makes obvious sense. So I say obvious sense, it's in deer, for example, you have an massive overrepresentative representation of males because people were predominantly targeting ones with big antlers, ones with big horns, that kind of stuff. But so it's not necessarily that surprising. But what my friend she's called Natalie Cooper. She does amazing science like this. Did find, particularly, she also then ran this analysis on reptiles and amphibians, was that you might expect that bias would change over time, right? So historically,
No.
you would see, you could understand why they would be collecting more males because they were shooting, the deer with whatever 15 prongs in its antlers.
Right. Or they want the bird with like the plumage to make the hat.
But you'd think that as you approach the current day, that bias would get less and less. And the way that she put it, she said, it's a beautifully flat graph.
Oh, jeez.
She's just like, it just doesn't change, even though there's no reason for modern day people to be doing that. But that's so happens.
Sad. And I'm not surprised, kind of going back to the point that you made when you're actually looking at these historical displays. And when I say historical, I mean right up to the present, where the male of the species is the only one on display, or it is somehow weighted differently, right? It's up a little bit higher, it's out in front, it's whatever. It reminds me of something I've mentioned before on the show in other contexts, but two examples that I'd love to grapple with you about. The first one is I remember being at my gym when I used to see a personal trainer, and there was a poster on the wall that said the musculoskeletal system, and it was the drawing of a man and all of his muscles and all of his bones, and then next to it there's a poster that said the female musculoskeletal system, and I was like, why doesn't that one say male? like why is the male of the species normative and female is other? And this is such a overt display of such an hidden bias. They've just made it overt. And I got into an argument once when I was doing a live podcast performance on my other show, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, with some audience members about that very thing. And I mentioned, bathroom signage. Why does the men's room look like a person? And then the women's room looks like a person in a dress. And they were like, well, how else would you identify? And I was like, I don't know. How about the women's room looks like a person and the men's room looks like a person with a mustache? And they were like, oh my God. It's just like mind blown. Like, why is the male of the species always normative?
And I think when it came to, for example, like that study looking at specimens in collections, one of the resounding responses from a lot of people was just like, oh, well, so what? Like, what difference does this make? And I know, like, and this is like when you start to like dig into it, you're just like, well, okay, if you're doing studies on the natural world, some males might have a different diet to females. So if you're looking at, trying to get a representative view of what this species eats, that's going to be skewed. Some sexes have higher parasite loads than the other, so that might change how you're looking at things. All these different little things, which I just don't think most people think about or consider, all have this knock-on impact. And whilst we can't change that we have this sex bias in these collections, the whole point within Science Rise, if you know about it, you can account for it and you can build that into your system and you can build that into your analysis. And that does actually give you better science at the end of it. And it just blew my mind. The response to that paper about having more males in collections was wild. As you can imagine, the tabloids hated it.
Of course, and I'm sure that the study authors were like targeted on social media. Like I would not be surprised by any of that. And it's so heartbreaking that when an individual who benefits from a certain bias doesn't have the empathy or isn't willing to exercise the empathy to understand why the individuals who don't benefit or who sometimes very acutely suffer from that bias would want to see that bias changed. Like, it's easy to go, so what if you're a dude? And I think that a lot when I look at the biomedical research where, oh, we're just not going to use women in this clinical trial because their cycles are weird and confusing, and I just don't want to have to deal with that as part of my data analysis. So we'll just do it on men, and then we'll say, okay, this is how it works for people. Like it blows my mind.
There was a whole thing recently in the UK about having a new study set up basically to look at, for example, the symptoms of heart attacks in women, because they are different to the symptoms you get in men. And there have been multiple cases in the UK of women phoning up the emergency services and describing these symptoms and them telling them, oh, it's fine, you'll be okay. And they've been having a heart attack at the end of the phone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see this so often, that our conceptions of, I think we've seen also like a lot of studies recently about sleep and like, why are women so tired all the time? Well, we're constantly being told that 8 hours is ideal, when that may not be the case for women. It may be closer to 9, and it may be closer to 7 for men. And I think one of the things that's tough is, yes, we do still have to operate with this constant understanding of statistical analysis. And maybe when we're talking about behaviors, or we're talking about, different queer behaviors in different animals or different plants or fungus, or these different groups, that we may be talking about, over here it's 20% of the population, over here it's 5% of the population, over here it's maybe 40% of the population. But I think the thing that's so frustrating for me so often when we're talking about straight gendered differences is that we have historically ignored literally half of the organisms.
And that happens and comes through so much in a lot of the research within natural history to do with things like sex and reproductive organs and things like that, right? I guess what I'm trying to say is sex in general in natural world has quite often been overlooked, right? And then where it has been researched, it is predominantly focusing on the penis, because that is what, most of the scientists had. Right.
Yeah. And had all sorts of weird emotional attachments too. Like, so, all sorts of strange stuff.
So like in recent times, you're getting all these really amazing papers coming out looking at, female animals and their reproductive anatomy. And, we're finding out, for example, that female dolphins have really massive clitorises. And you're just like, wow, like...
Yeah, and we didn't know that until now. How's that possible?
Exactly. There was a really recent one which was talking about how snakes have paired clitorises. And you're just like, that's really amazing. And so then you start to say, okay, well, if snakes and dolphins have it, surely, presumably, does everything in between have it? So you then have to start going and looking to filling on all those gaps. And you start to spur more questions on. And then it starts to ask questions about, the purpose of sex. And like, are these animals, enjoying it? Is there any pleasure involved? What is the purpose? And so what blows my mind is that by ignoring all these things and ignoring these, or focusing very narrowly on certain aspects, you are just completely ignoring and putting into the dark a whole range and a whole field, effectively, of work that has incredible questions and could answer all sorts of interesting things and then feed back to what we were looking at the penis, like maybe it'll help answer reasons why penises are really weird shapes in lots of animals, all sorts of things. And it's just so, to me, sort of like blinkered and blinded. And I find that deeply frustrating because presumably, the assumption is obviously like as science, science is, again, quote unquote, objective, but it's obviously not, and we know it isn't. But people still cling on to that idea that science is all about facts and it is all about the truth without ever really interrogating, where that science is coming from and who is doing that science. And I find that deeply frustrating when having these conversations with people.
As do I. And I think it also highlights this other bias that I often struggle with. We talked about it recently on the other show that I work on, and I don't think it made it to air. I think they had to use it as premium content so the patrons can listen. But this idea, I don't know, maybe this is appropriate for this conversation, maybe it's not. I'm curious what you think. This idea that somehow science is objective and has no human biases in it. And beyond that, that sort of to be objective is to be not amoral, but like non-moralistic. And to be objective is to not engage in conversations about feelings, that sort of like there's this bias in science that cognition is king and feelings just make everything dirty and non-scientific. And I think I see that represented as a psychologist. This makes me crazy, but I think I also see it represented so often in this gendered kind of washing of the literature, the sort of like penis prioritization when we're looking at the literature, because what it really does is it dehumanizes the female experience completely. This idea that sex, like we talked about before, that there's sort of a receptacle objectification that's quite assaulty and rapey when it really comes down to it. And I think that extends to human beings, right? So historical literature, why would we need to study a clitoris? Women, sex is not about pleasure, sex is just about procreation. And then you look at the animal kingdom and it's like, well, why would they have sex for pleasure? That makes no sense. They're lowly animals. Well, why do they play? Like animals play. It's probably like the most observed behavior that we see.
All of those ideas about like the purpose of sex as well has also fed very heavily into how historically we've viewed homosexual behaviors in animals as well.
Right.
For a really long time, it has been referred to as Darwin's paradox, because the only reason for sex is reproduction, right? And so why would two males be having sex?
Right. So then like that it follows that it's somehow aberrant or wrong or somehow not quite right.
That's a really persistent notion and has been going on for a really long time, and up until quite recently, really, and is only in relatively recent terms, I guess, we've come to understand that sex has lots of different functions. It's not just to procreate and to have babies, as Darwin suggested. But also going back to your point about sort of the science being sort of, amoral and objective. Again, there's I always found this a really lovely example in which when Jane Goodall first started working on chimpanzees in East Africa, when she turned up at the study site, all those chimpanzees had numbers and letters as names. And she went into that forest and she started giving them human names. And the male scientists chastised her for it and said, why are you calling one of them David? Why are you calling one of them Gary, whatever? And criticized her for it. And she turned around and was like, no, they are clearly individual animals that have their own personalities. Why wouldn't you be doing this? But I find it fascinating that, again, it took a woman going in to do that research, to make that active decision, and to stick by it. And now
I can imagine that Gary was treated differently than CR19 or whatever. That actually it affected the behavior. Like that's the interesting thing. Every one of these choices changes things, but it doesn't mean that it's making it less objective. It just means that it's a new layer to the scientific engagement and a new richness to how we do science.
Yeah, and if you go to any great ape research station now, I'll tell you what, they name all their apes.
Of course. Of course. And they probably are, my guess would be that they also, I mean, maybe this has nothing to do with it, maybe it's just about the time, but that their welfare is more paramount. Because if there's an animal with a name, then there's also, I think, an obligation to that animal. And it does become very different when we distance ourselves and we separate ourselves from our work in that way.
And I'll tell you, as someone who's worked with great apes in the wild, the idea that you can sit there and watch these animals and not think of them as individuals with their own agency and personality, like, blows my mind.
Yeah. And doing that doesn't make the science less sciencey. That's the part that always just really gets me, this layer to how we have long viewed the scientific method as, quote, cold and detached and objective, and that somehow makes the science better. I grappled with this when I wrote my dissertation. I did a hermeneutic phenomenological dissertation, so qualitative dissertation. And I grappled with, what Heidegger said, which is I can't completely detach myself from the thing I am researching. So instead, I'm going to call my biases out and make them explicit, because then I can actually grapple with them. Like, that's what we should all be doing, right?
Yeah, and it goes back again, everything just sort of links back to that study about the sex bias in collections. If you know that the bias exists, you can account for it. And you can work, you can build that into your model and you can build that into your system. And that in the long run gives you better science.
Ugh, I love it. I'm curious, looking through your book, flipping through the different organisms that are highlighted in it, is there anything that you want to point out? I know you've pointed to a few of them, and obviously we don't want to spoiler alert the whole book, but is there anything that just really blew your mind when you discovered it and you're like, I have to include this because people are going to be like, what?
Yeah, so probably my all-time favorite one is there's a section on the Humboldt woodlouse, right? And they have some populations have a sex determination system that is controlled by bacteria rather than like genes or environment or anything like that. And it absolutely blew my mind. So within woodlice, they typically have a sex determination system, which is ZZ-ZW. So in that case, the males have the ZZ chromosomes and the females have the ZW. So kind of the opposite to what is usually happens in people. But there's this bacteria called Wolbachia, and it infects something wild, like 66% of all insect species are infected by this bacteria. So it's astonishingly successful. And it passes through the matrilineal sort of side. So it passes from female to female. So that means that for this bacteria, it is advantageous to have more females in the population. So it has, in some populations of woodlice, it has hijacked the sort of sex determination system, and it is changing all of them to female. Just try to get this right in my brain. To the extent, and that has been going on for so long, that effectively the female sex chromosome became useless. So the woodlice lost the W chromosome. So you had males, which were ZZ and uninfected, and females that were ZZ but infected, right?
Wow.
Which is
and then that's now how you sex type these.
And so that is how.
That
and then it goes one step further, because then in the 1980s they found one population of these woodlice in which they had uninfected ZZ females, and they discovered that the section of DNA in the Wolbachia that controlled the sex had got reinserted back into the genome of the woodlice, and they'd effectively re-evolved a sex chromosome. And this was a completely novel way of evolving a sex chromosome that nobody knew existed before they studied these woodlice.
Well, and it makes perfect sense, actually. It's so funny because as you're describing it, I'm like, whoa, because we've never heard of that. It's also like how a lot of coding changes, right? Like bacteria often swap genetic material. They often insert it. I mean, it's how CRISPR was like developed. And so it's like really interesting to think that
the majority, I think isn't something wild like the majority of the human genome is just like junk DNA anyway. Because it's just
right. It's
viruses
just all
and bacteria and
back
stuff.
And forth, just chewing it up and spitting it out. And so it's like, oh, duh. Like as you explain it, I'm like, of course that would happen. But then, of course, when you first discover it, you're like, what?
But it's amazing that this bacteria, first of all, like caused them to lose a sex chromosome.
Yeah,
and
that's
then
really
the selection
wild.
pressure was obviously there to like reinsert it back in again. And then you get it in other species. So there's a species of wasp in which the Wolbachia has basically caused the wasp to be an all-female species. So because wasps reproduce in a slightly different way, in which when a female lays an egg, like a fully fertilized egg will develop as a female, but an unfertilized egg, so it has half the genetic information, will develop as a male. And infected male eggs, the Wolbachia effectively just like doubles the chromosomes, so forces them to become female. And they've done experiments where they have sort of cured those eggs of the Wolbachia bacteria. They've killed the bacteria off, and those eggs develop as normal males. But when those males then try to have mate with the females, they think that because they've been an all-female species for so long, there has been some sort of corruption in the sex genes, so they can't sexually reproduce, even if there are males in the population.
Oh, yeah. Just
It's
don't need them anymore.
Redundant. Exactly. I know. And because it's like this pressure and this like the way it controls the sex determination, they think that it's even potentially isolating certain populations and causing new species of insects to evolve. And I just absolutely just like, why are we not all talking about this bacteria?
Seriously. No, it's cool too, because it does highlight that when we talk about both of these examples that you just shared, a mechanism that's happening at the individual and then the population and the species level, but like just the downstream ecological effects of that is a whole other layer of complexity.
So there are some scientists trying to, in a similar way to this, utilize Wolbachia now to genetically engineer, for example, malaria mosquitoes. So they're trying to use that Wolbachia bacteria to, alter the populations of malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and so hopefully solve some of those issues.
That would be lovely. So yeah, not just fascinating, because I know it, the world is a richer place, science, but also applied science to do, of course, because we're all narcissists, good for the human species.
Yep. Everything has to benefit us somehow.
It does. Otherwise, we don't want to fund it. So I have to ask Josh, I think, and maybe this is a question that you already in some ways answered. Maybe you're like, I don't know, and that's okay. But how has working on this book, and of course, working on this book also entails all of the work you did leading up to it and sort of cataloging and categorizing and noticing these things in the collections. But how has this engagement, I guess, altered or influenced your work as a whole?
That's a really good question. I think it has definitely made me, as a writer, and as someone who has been writing now for the last 10 years and about science and about research, I think it has definitely changed the way in which I consider the words I use and the language that I use and how you are describing certain things. And I would hope that might be the case with some people who read the book. I think that idea, the example earlier about, for example, the sunfish and describing those intermediates as like sneaky and the alternative lifestyles. And I think that is stuff which you hear in like nature documentaries now is so sort of ingrained in our lexicon and our culture within biology. I would hope that would maybe make people reconsider using those words and using that language. And in fact, one of the fish scientists at the museum read that chapter, and he did tell me he had never thought about it in those terms before, and that he was going to change the way that he talks about these things.
Oh, I love that so much. And it's so important because I do think it increases the sort of rigor of the entire field, but B, words impact people. And when we engage with public science communication, whether it's a nature documentary, a book, a lecture course, and those biases are there are people that they harm, and there are people that they prop up, and they perpetuate, and they grow, and they build on one another. And to sort of change that landscape, it's something as simple as words can really be very powerful, to help certain people feel included, to help certain people feel like they are not less than, to engage more people in the conversation, and to bring the conversation, I think, to a level of rigor that it deserves.
And we can see that playing out within natural history with, for example, all the debates going around about offensive species names, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like these as again we were saying earlier, to people who aren't impacted, the gut reaction is so what? But it does make a difference to people. And,
Mhm.
as you say, it's so simple. It's just like changing the word that you use. It's
Yeah.
not going to kill anyone. It's not going to harm anyone.
Yeah.
But it could make someone reading it or someone engaging with it feel more welcome and feel more accepted.
Yeah. Why
And
not do that? If you can do
exactly.
something so simple and it makes somebody's life better, and it's like a negative feedback thing, right? It's not positive feedback. It doesn't make their life better because you're propping them up. It makes their life better because you're removing something harmful that they're constantly being bombarded with. That's why not? Ugh, I love it. Josh, thank you so much, not just for being here with us for this hour, because obviously I learned an awful lot and I love engaging in these topics, but for the incredible work that you do and for taking the time and the energy to put together this lovely little volume that's so full of interesting information. It's like really readable. It's very visual. It's quite a beautiful little book, and yeah, I think it could really change some minds about a lot of things and plant some seeds that need to be planted across the globe. So I'm just really grateful for you and for the work that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. That would be the dream.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk movie.